All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the fifth episode of season 2 of This, That, and the Other. My name is Varun Chandra Mohan, your host for today. Just to give everyone a little bit of a background, This, That, and the Other is a series that tackles some of the biggest and most debated topics that both managers and employees encounter in their professional and personal life. So far in the series, we've explored topics such as the pursuit of happiness, and if it was a fool's dream or a possibility. We've looked at longevity and whether it was down to genetics or choice. We've looked at bias in the workplace, and we spoke about when personal life choices collide with your professional life. And just last week, we spoke about office politics and the art of sucking up. Now, on today's show, we will be exploring a rather interesting topic. It's spoken about widely, but not so much implemented. We're going to be talking about disruptive HR practices, and we're going to be specifically focusing on, are they easier said than done? And just a reminder to everyone, all our past episodes of This, That, and the Other and our other webinar series are available on Luminary Learning Solutions YouTube page. Do swing by our page and don't forget to like our videos and hit that subscribe button. All right, it's time to introduce my guests for the day from around the world. And first up, she is a clinical psychologist, an award-winning speaker, innovator, organizational and peak performance trainer, and an expert in human behavior, A.H.A. intelligence, and flow state. Heleniq Argyrou is here with us today. Hello, Heleniq. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Varun. So much joy to be with all of you today. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. And finally, he's a global speaker and facilitator, a corporate rebel, an emerging thought leader and influencer in the space of disruptive leadership. And he's also an upcoming author and CEO of Fired Leadership. Paul McCarthy is here with us today. Hello, Paul. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again. It's lovely to be here. So looking forward to a great debate and great discussion.
The pleasure is ours. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. All right, in the best interest of our audience, I want to start off our conversation by asking my panel about disruption itself. And I'd like to start with you, Paul. What is disruption and why should people be aware of it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's something that's it's become part of our common vernacular in terms of how we speak these days in the corporate world. I think, just a quick few minutes ago, a quick Google search of disruptive HR or disruption yields 300 million Google hits. Right. When you say disruptive HR practices, that's another 7.5 million Google hits.
Wow.
So I think it's fair to say that it's become so much part of the way we do things. And yet, in over almost 25 years of working in the field of leadership and HR, I've seen marginal attempts at disruption. So for me, right, when you ask what does disruption mean, it means the ability, and I used this at a conference last year in Toronto with a group of forward-thinking HR leaders they were looking at the leadership of tomorrow and the HR world of tomorrow and what their role could be. And I was in this day-long conference, and they were all talking about disruption, and they were all talking about it academically, and not one of them actually spoke about what they were going to do differently when they left. So right. This phrase, you have the opportunity to blow up the table, because they a very long story. I'll cut it short for the listeners and everyone.
Right.
25 years ago, the role of HR was not very disruptive. It was quite transactional. So, benefits based, very kind of like looking at pink slips, looking at statutory holidays, everything like that.
Yeah.
Then a few years after, it became quite involved in transformation, to the point that, I used to use the analogy of the table. So transactional HR didn't get a seat at the table. Then all of a sudden it started getting involved in strategic things. It got a seat at the table. So it had this idea of potentially being disruptive, but it still had no teeth. So HR as a discipline was still very much advisory, sitting on the sidelines. I was at this conference last year, and right, these guys and girls were talking about the future of HR and disruption. And I said, you now have an opportunity to decide if it's a table or not, because right, you spent 25 years getting to the table, and now you're questioning what your role is here. So my whole point about this is it easier said than done? I actually think it is to be disruptive, because really, in a nutshell, to be disruptive is to think differently about something, to think about how can you do something in a way that might yield failure, might be successful, like Carol Dweck's approach to mindset work. Really, if you change your mindset about something, you can really have such an impact. I think a lot of us tend to overcomplicate and complex things, especially in the HR world. So a long drawn out way of basically saying I've seen a lot of people talk about disruption, but it really, for me, comes down to a simple case of what are you doing that's different? Are you daring to be different? And let's throw out the playbook, because we don't have to actually follow any established processes, and we never had to. So I'll pause there for some thoughts.
Sure, thanks, Paul. Heleniq, any thoughts on what disruption is and about what Paul was saying?
Yeah, I'm getting very excited. I love to be on panels with people that are rebellious, mavericks, visionaries, are really born from this category of people that are non-conformists, the people that jump out of the boxes. So I'm very excited about today's discussion. I think it's actually clear to look into the world now and realize that we have been disrupted, whether we quit that or not. I think HR, out of everything in the world right now, is certainly one of the most disrupted spaces in the business sector. And I think we've called into many different things. Listening to Paul speaking today already, we've hit on some major points that I think would be great to unravel in this discussion. One is really, how do we turn things on their heads and get the best out of that? Why is that a good thing? And I love working with activists all my life in NGO sector, in many different peacekeeping missions, or even in kind of grassroots projects. People that can bring this different perspective to a very established space are the ones that can bring the change. And I think the world at the moment is, when we look at human behavior, human beings are very afraid of change. We like power, privilege, established norms. We like predictability, certainty. It gives us a sense of security. So, of course, it's not going to be a very easy thing to translate a disruptive mindset into the workplace. So you can see the result of that is that we are then forced into the change. So Jung said this great thing, very famous psychiatrist from back when psychology started. He said that whatever we do not work on within ourselves will manifest as fate. And I think as a world population, we are now sitting in that exact space where we realize that we have not done enough of the work that Paul's been talking about in those conferences. People have not been applying the knowledge, have not been managing to make the changes, to really look at how to change the system into an experimental space, to be able to be unafraid of the change, to be able to explore, create, invent, innovate, and really do things wrong so that you can find a new way of doing it right. So we don't have enough of that mindset out there. The growth mindset, I love that you mentioned that again, Paul. Carol Dweck's work is really important in my work individually with people in the psychotherapeutic space. But also we see now globally, we all have to work into this new way of understanding what growth really is. And it means we have to push past the comfort zone. We need to get into a zone where we are no longer looking for the ego to show itself and appear like it's doing things right, that actually our egos are not what we're after. We're after our essence, our true nature. And that means we need to create. And to create, you have to play in the sandbox and make a mess. And we don't let kids do that anymore either. We manicure gardens, we manage education, we create all kinds of distorted ideas about health and well-being, being a nice, neat little doctor visit, when in fact, we need many different inventive practices to actually develop solutions for where we are now. And we haven't managed to do that enough or quick enough, so we have been disrupted. So it's a great place for us to now start a new conversation about what actually are we going to do with workforces right now, and the way people are dealing with leadership, development, learning in the environment? How are we going to be adaptive? How do we develop a kind of agility that the world now needs, especially in business?
Right.
I leave it there too, so we can come back to Paul or to Arun.
Thanks, Heleniq. Some very, very good points. So I have an interesting question to ask. How would you approach this if you were the CEO of a company, or if you were the head of HR? Would you approach this as, how do I solve a problem? Is that the kind of approach that you will take, or are you going to switch on that switch, saying, okay, I've got to do something that's disruptive. What can I do that's disruptive? Do you go down that path? How would you approach this? This is open to.
Okay, I mean, I first of all, thank you for Heleniq, your comments there and some of the areas that you touched upon. I furiously scribbling down some notes because I don't want to forget some of the things that you mentioned, and I can already tell again this is going to be really interesting as a discussion. I'm just going to touch upon one of the things Heleniq talked about in terms of the mindset and the fear of change and how we approach what I call rebellious, disruptive leadership, but extending that to HR practices, because if you think about disruptions in HR, you've got things like the performance management and development process. We all know that system is outdated. It's defunct. It needs to be enhanced. No longer is it acceptable to say we're effectively developing someone's performance, but we only speak to them once a year in a cursory 30-minute conversation, and there's some predetermined variables that say, well, you're not in the upper right quadrant, so you're out of the organization or you're not demoted. The recruitment process, the approach to self-directed learning and experiential learning, digital leadership, the idea of leadership in itself, all of these plus HRMSs, and also how do HR practices deal with predictive analytics to inform their recruitment processes. All of these things are on the agenda for HR if they're brave enough, right? So coming back to your question, Varun, I love the concept of simplicity. So, Heleniq talks about ego and, playing in the sandbox. I can't remember the exact thing you just said, but playing in the sandbox sometimes gets messy. And I've always been struck by an author called Eric Wahl, W-A-H-L. He wrote this book called Unthink. And the concept of unthink is, what about if we went back into the boardroom as leaders and decision makers in our organizations and thought like children and approached the tasks that we had in a simplified, yet to be conditioned by the societal forces at play when we looked at how we wanted to prioritize things. So he's saying, bring back a childlike curiosity and passion to the boardroom. And it's actually this kind of disruptive thinking is how I would approach answering your question there, is what would you do if you're an HR head? And for me, frankly, it's about creating the conditions, what I just mentioned, to happen. But in order to do that, you have to create the environment where you can have honest-based conversations amongst your leadership team. And I'm glad you touched upon ego, Heleniq, because the work of fired leadership is all about exposing the hypocrisy of leadership and the hypocrisy of HR practices. So I don't think we can actually start any meaningful discussion or action-orientated activities unless we address the elephant in the room, which is the politics in organizations, the dysfunctional approach to HR and leadership. And quite frankly, the fact that I've worked with hundreds of organizations and hundreds of leaders, and every single one of them plays the political game. Every single one of them says that they want to achieve some type of transformation. But to Heleniq's point, we have a fear of change. So when it gets to the point where now, to use a corny North American term, the rubber hits the road, we've got to start getting going on this transformation now, haven't we? They don't want to, because it means we have to look inward. And so if I was an HR head or a head of leadership development or a CEO listening to this session that we're doing, I mean, guys and girls, you've read the books. You've probably got the books from the gurus on your bookshelf, and yet the way you approach HR and leadership is in complete incongruence to all of the advice and thought we're out there. Yeah. It's time to look in the mirror, and it's time to have an honest conversation about our approach to this. That's the first thing I would do if I was in an HR VP's position right now.
Oh, absolutely spot on, Paul. And before I move on to Heleniq's thoughts, I think Katherine is here with us. Hello, Katherine.
Hello. Apologies.
Technical issues. Oh, no worries.
Great to be.
No worries at all. So let me introduce Katherine to the audience. Well, she's an expert in people and high performance organizations, and she has an extensive experience working with corporations, startups, and the technology industry. And currently she serves as the CEO of Embrink, an independent technology advisory in New Zealand. So welcome to the show, Katherine. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you very much.
So Katherine, we were just discussing about how would one approach disruptions, and if you were the CEO of a company, if you were the head of HR, how would you approach disruption? So we're just going to jump back to Heleniq, and Heleniq wants to share your thoughts. We would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So Heleniq, any thoughts on how would you approach if you were the CEO? And
yeah, good morning, Katherine. Lovely to have you here. It's a nice warmed up conversation already, and I'm excited to hear everybody speaking, because I think we're getting deeper into the real marrow of this, because I want to jump back right into what I think is the core, let's say the core problem and the core solution to almost everything in life is self-awareness. And I truly believe that leaders right now are under a lot of strain, a lot of pressure, and I want to bring in again something that I think is the second most important thing, which is compassion. And we live in a world right now where we are, I think, being challenged to develop both at the deepest level.
Heleniq, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I think we may have lost Heleniq.
I was excited to hear what she had to say just then, just at that point. Because I love the reference to compassion and compassionate leadership, and Katherine, I don't know your particular viewpoints on your Prime Minister, although I actually reference her in my upcoming book, Fired Leadership, and I reference her specifically for her compassionate leadership capabilities under the areas that I'm writing about. So it's quite a interesting approach to leadership that has received some criticism, but also has received some accolades around the world as well. So I'm personally interested to have a Kiwi on the discussion here, because I'd love your views actually on that, and in terms of compassionate leadership.
Yeah, Katherine, would love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Okay. It's always a bit uncomfortable talking about politics, and when we're talking this evening is actually the evening of the New Zealand election. So there is a lot changing here. Our Prime Minister has a really refreshing style. I think that's why it's got so much interest in the world. But although it's refreshing, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. And it's great in response to social emergencies like the shootings that we had in Christchurch. I'm not sure that it's always good, because somebody can use the word kind, as she does quite often, but the things a government has to do are not always kind. So if you have a leadership being kind, but then if it was a corporate organization, making redundancies or changing jobs so people can't do the work they like, then it's a double-edged sword, and I think you lose trust. So it needs to be appropriate for the situation, would be my comment.
That's interesting, because the work that I'm doing around fired leadership and looking at trends in HR and leadership, I use the analogy of I compare it to the whistleblower. So nobody thanks the whistleblower as they're blowing the whistle. Nobody thanks them during it. But when legislation changes and when policy changes, everybody's so thankful the whistleblower put their neck on the line. So, you think of Steve Jobs. Nobody really liked Steve Jobs in the business world, but he was a visionary. He took risks. He was disruptive. Nobody really liked Winston Churchill. He actually usurped Chamberlain who actually faltered under Hitler, and Churchill saw an opportunity as a leader to be disruptive, and he bulldozed in. He quite frankly, he's probably one of, and again, not going to politics, of course, but it's probably the people that saved the United Kingdom from being taken over by a Nazi regime. Donald Trump, the infamous Donald Trump. Now, these three people and Jacinda from New Zealand are all examples from my research of what we call unfiltered leaders. They're leaders that have a very unscripted, very different approach to leadership, and they don't play by the rules. So sometimes, like for instance, Churchill, he was a great wartime leader, but as soon as the war ended, he was elected out. Steve Jobs, the infamous Steve Jobs, was fired a few times. He was fired from Atari. He was fired from Apple. He was asked back to those organizations because they knew his disruptive approach to leadership worked. He wasn't a nice guy. And I don't make any claims on your prime minister at the moment at all in any way, and wouldn't want to take it down that path. But it is interesting that sometimes in order to disrupt, we have to be unpopular. And so, I see that in the work that I do with leadership teams all the time. And what then ends up happening is that we all say the leadership approach, the approach to HR is broken, needs to be improved. But not one of us really wants to bite the hand that feeds us. We're all great standing on the sidelines, like Brené Brown talks about, and throwing, peanuts from the peanut gallery from the cheap seats. But how many of us are actually going to practice what we preach and get into the ring, the gladiator ring, to actually take the gloves off and have these conversations, the hard conversations that matter? Because we all care too much about our corporate mold, I think. So I'm fascinated by our thoughts on this, because can we truly be disruptive if we're not willing to pay the ultimate price of what disruption leads to?
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah, Katherine, really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Yeah.
Sure. So you raised the very valid point that leadership doesn't need to be popular, and often in terms of crisis, it almost can't be, depending on the action taken. So that is difficult. And then if you look at leadership in a corporate perspective, and HR and other leaders needing to be the leaders of change and disruption, we run into the issue that not only is it not always popular, but there's also loss associated with change.
Right.
They're inflicting loss and experiencing loss themselves, unless they're fully into what's happening. And that is really difficult, and that's probably why you have people putting their hand up and saying, I'm doing innovation, doing digital transformation, and they're quite happy running programs that don't actually result in concrete change.
Right.
So I think we're seeing a lot of people talking about things, experimenting with them, but not actually changing the situation. And that worries me, because what we're then doing, even though it looks good, is wasting a lot of resource and energy, and would be better off not half doing things. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but you almost need to be brave to do that, saying I'm not going to do it because we're not really ready. Rather than.
For sure.
Well, I'm drawn to an example that I basically am quite close to from someone in the world of leadership that I've been researching, a guy called Nick Cirillo, and he talk about brave leadership and being unpopular, and that I love when you mentioned, Katherine, the loss associated with change, because in another world, what I've done is I've actually done a lot of work around from a change management perspective in terms of understanding the loss and grief experienced by people who go through change and transformation. But one of the things that I was struck by Nick Cirillo, Sarillo, was that he had opened a series of pizza Subway shops and in Chicago, or just outside Chicago, Illinois, and he had overstretched himself, and he was at the point where some of those outlets were going to go bankrupt. Right. And he was advised against by the shareholders, the bank, his family, attorneys, all of the people in the safe world, in the corporate mold, that he shouldn't write an open letter to his staff. I think he had quite a few hundred staff, and he should not be honest about the predicament that they were in. And he took everything on board, and he said, no, I owe it as a leader. I have to have courage and be brave. So he wrote a letter basically accepting that all of this was his doing, and said we might need to shut the doors on our stores because we've overstretched. As a result, the story had a happy ending because he was able to raise the finances and keep the stores open. But it exemplified, I think, when someone transcends those boundaries, by taking that ability to be real as a leader and to be vulnerable and therefore to be brave. And through that, he was very disruptive in the approach that he took to leadership. So there are some outliers out there, which is what fascinates me in terms of the people that talk a good talk, but they stay on the sidelines and they say, well, it's too hard, so we better not do it. Like I think we have to find people that are willing to get into the mess with us and to really just, and not worry about career advancement or being overlooked for those projects, or the loss is too great. So why would we even do something? And so anyway, just curious about your thoughts on that, Varun.
Oh no, absolutely. I think you actually struck a nerve on that. And by the way, just a quick intro. I think we've got Heleniq back, Paul and Katherine. Oh, hello, Heleniq.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Sorry that it was a technical glitch.
No worries.
Seems like Paul needed some time with each of us independently, and now we're back all together. So I'm loving the conversation where it is now, because actually I realized you spoke about grief and loss, and this was where I was going to head to myself. I think it's a very important variable, and I think as a society, a human species, really, we don't deal with loss and grief very well. We don't deal with a lot of emotion very well, and this is why we've had such a surgence of EQ, as a whole new phenomenon, when in fact it's the core of what makes us human. And I think when we don't deal with emotion very well, what we see is instead a lot of defense and a lot of coping skills and mechanisms that are really put in place to try and help us keep running, or keep appearing that we're okay, or keep showing up as fine, or the leader that we've always thought we were, etc. So for me, we were really at that point of looking at what does a leader really do now, and I want to just acknowledge the great pressure that we are under, and the absolute need to now align with the disruption that's happened and to begin to work in this situational type leadership space and trust in something far greater than our own human intelligence. And I really do believe that the universe has within it something that is far greater and deeper than human intelligence. And we don't know what that is when we buy into what I was speaking about initially, this ego-inflated state that likes to have the power and exercise the power and show up as better than, or cleverer than, or more informed. So what you were saying, Paul, is, very much a case in point where the courage to really become the person and to show up as the fallible or the humbled leader in front of your people is the exact, I believe, at least substance for the alchemy to truly start to happen. And it's not going to transform the entire community or the entire organization or corporation if that is not present. It's certainly in a time like now. So those who can really believe into the greater intelligence, the source of all creation, the source of all transformation, which is a very big ask for a lot of people, because perhaps we don't all have the same, let's say, spiritual view or the same cosmological understanding of what we're all busy doing here on this whole planet. But it's not just a company with a group of people. It's an entire planet. It's an entire cosmos, an entire universe. And the more we can think in that expansive way, the more we understand that our role in that group or community is to be the instrument of change, or the instrument that can hold this faith in the transformation.
Sure.
So I truly believe that our leaders need to not only be self-aware and compassionate, but they need to start adding in this permission to be the instruments of change, or the leaders of change, truly the actually ready human being in that mass that is willing to set themselves up to be the one that will become actualized before the others, and then assist others to follow suit. And what does that mean? It means we can no longer afford to have people in leadership positions that are not doing the work on themselves at the deepest level. We just simply will not trust in them. We need to be following people that have been through a valley of darkness and have found the light, and they can uphold that in some way, shape, or form in front of their people. And that does mean becoming humbled. It means being able to deal with vulnerability. It means being able to be intuitive, to respond to a situation, to not have to have a prescribed manual or go back to past best practices, or look at kind of what other people are doing, or get into, feelings of jealousy and envy and all kinds of competitive lower feelings that drive us into kind of anxiety-based leadership styles. So it takes real strength, courage, and power right now. And that is what we are busy doing. I truly believe as organizations, we are looking for the people that can actually go through that process, because they are the ones that can lead the rest, certainly in HR. So right now, on the list, I think if I can list them, I wanted to say it before and I'll add it in here, because I think it's still relevant as we're looking at what does a leader really need to be doing, is to be able to deal with emotions at a real level. Emotional intelligence has to start infiltrating into practices, into daily practice. I mean, during lockdown, we had, so many summits myself with global female leaders, and we were talking a lot about EQ and how important EQ is now forced onto the agenda, whereas before it would kind of trickle in. You cannot avoid it anymore. We have to be looking at sustainability. Leaders have to begin to think about what Katherine just mentioned about the sustainability of resources, that it's irresponsible to be brainstorming or masterminding change ideas and not have the courage to get messy about experimenting with them. It's actually a waste of energy to do that. So yes, we have to upgrade our ability to deal with it, to become inclusive, very, very important. Sure. To also really deal with the challenges of the digital space and technology. We need lots of think tanking about how that's really going to work, because the health and safety, and especially I think it's such an important area, AI and the health of the individual is becoming a new feature area for myself as a psychologist, thinking very seriously about teenagers on devices becoming future leaders are going to have very distorted states of mental functioning that we have to think about for the future of leadership. And we have to have enough leaders out there experimenting with tech and putting in parameters so that there's life-work balance. We have to start that work from where we are now, experimenting with what is the best way to keep ourselves healthy, while we work remotely. And we need a lot of exploration on that. So we cannot jump back to the past and think we have answers. We have to be humbled enough to say we don't, and we have to explore. And also the space of play that we mentioned earlier on when Paul brought that up, such an important thing is really how do we play with our challenges, our problems, and experiment here, and then start to get serious about helping our leaders become the ones who are going to become self-actualized, and for them to have the courage to do that so that they can become true caliber of leader for the future.
I agree. Sorry, Paul, you had.
Well, yeah, I was again just noting down some points that you made, Heleniq. I think all great salient points, and one of the things I would draw our attention to is the fact, I agree with everything you've said, and we are, as a macro level, we are continuing to invest in, as this is going down leadership, I just wanted to bring this into a leadership mindset at the moment. We're investing almost $400 billion every year on leadership development. And recent studies from DDI and Conference Board and EY estimate that only 14% of CEOs believe they have the leader bench strength needed for the next 3 to 5 years to address their business challenges. And by the way, that study was done before COVID. And so I look at this at a macro level, and I think disruption, you've got disruption of the HR field, and I'm in a group leadership in with this for the time being, but you've got that macro level thing, which is at the economic level. But and close related to that, you've got your point about heart-centered leadership, humble leadership. We've got a change in organizational structures coming. So, we're moving away from the draconian command control matrix driven organization to self-management, and, popularized by the work of Frederick Laloux from Reinventing Organizations. We're moving to more of a teal-based organizational structure, which in itself, a lot of people that refuse to come into the new world and the future are dismissing as just fluff. However, what we're seeing around the world with companies like Spotify and the Hire Group from China, which has used a self-managing structure to transform its organization and its leadership from the worst performing manufacturing business in the world to the most successful. And then we're thinking of Ricardo Semler and Semco and the way that he pioneered self-management. All of this to say that there's what I call an organizational cliff approaching us. So we need a different type of leader anyway in order to navigate those waters. So think about it. Almost 400 billion is being spent on ineffective leadership development. CEOs are saying that we don't have the talent that we need at a leadership level anyway. And this cliff is already approaching us. This tidal wave is already approaching us. Throw COVID into the mix. And by the way, COVID is just the start. We are facing more disruption now at leadership level than ever before. So even those that attend leadership development programs are saying that, when you talk about EQ and you talked about like heart-centered, humble leadership, you can't really teach that stuff. You have to get in the trenches. You have to, I love what you said, Heleniq, the valley of darkness. Like you need leaders to get in who have experienced the valley of darkness and actually been there on the front line, because that's how you build empathy, compassion. You can't teach that stuff. So all of that to say that the way that we're changing our organizational structures is leading to a change in the way the leadership industry is looking. And also then you take it down to the leadership level. Leaders are now looking for organizations to join where they have a sense of purpose, where their sense of purpose aligns to the organization. EY did a study, it was a few years ago, I'm just looking at my notes here, that basically said purpose is key to driving people's work and focus. 96% of leaders that were surveyed in that study indicated that purpose was more important to them and their job satisfaction than anything else. And here's the bottom line for the people that are interested in the P&L and the ROI of all this. Organizations that operate without a sense of purpose-driven culture underperform their competitors by up to 42%. So there's clearly a business reason for this, and there's clearly a moral reason for why, and a human-centered reason for why we need to be adapting the way that we look at leadership and the leadership we need for the future. Because if we don't, I fear that the disruption facing us, we're just going to throw the same old stuff at the future, and it hasn't worked up to now. So, and I got reams and reams of statistics that showcase this from all of the global studies that have been done on leadership.
Sure.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's this isn't slowing down. This is just becoming more of a theme for how we work.
Sure. So one of the things is that I think the moment we brought this topic up, and we kind of floated it around the corporates and our regular viewers, one of the things that they really wanted to know about was what's the latest or craziest HR disruptive practices that are out there at the moment. So I'd like to start with you, Katherine, and then we can go around the table. Like what have you seen, in the last few years that you've just looked at it? It's either at your organization, around the world, something that you looked at and went, okay, that's wonderful, and something you didn't expect. Anything that you've seen in the world right now?
Yes, I've seen lots of things. Strangely, the one that I found has had the biggest impact on HR is the increased use of OCR technology, optical character recognition, and organizations using that so that HR people are not doing data entry. Now that sounds simple and quite boring, but that frees people up to do other things. So I believe in using technology where it has a really practical impact and giving people more time to do important work with the organization. It's like that. I've seen lots of silly, unsafe things done with AI, and I know there's a big hype about that. I'm on the board of an AI project at the moment and understand at a very deep level what needs to be done in order for AI to be used ethically, and there aren't many solutions out there that currently do that. If you are using an AI solution for HR and that data is going to a server, not only are there all sorts of ethical issues with that, but just in terms of compliance, I don't understand how that would meet any data protection or privacy compliance at the moment. So I worry about experimentation with technology. I know that that's something that is done, but I think it's unsafe. I think organizations that do really well are the ones that work out what they need based on their problems or ambitions and choose technology to solve that. Experimentation is another way of saying we're working on something without really doing it, and you wouldn't do that with people. You wouldn't do that with other types of investment, so I don't think you should do that with technology. And HR people are experts on HR work, so they know what their requirements are.
Sure. Paul, Heleniq?
Well, one of I'm just looking at some of the notes I've made from the research for my work, but one of the craziest, couple of things really. One of the things that's starting to gather the momentum and the pace of organizations is to start doing culture screenings earlier. So Spotify, for instance, hire for culture fit before they even talk to a candidate about roles. And so many might ask, well, why bother with that? But it's time consuming, everything like that. But organizations that are more agile, quick to diversify and to change things that don't work, they're nimble enough. So Spotify has instituted that across its whole recruitment policy. And there are other examples from my friends over at Corporate Rebels who wrote a book called Corporate Rebels, which is all about making work more fun. The second thing I've seen, and it's in line with one of the things I just mentioned, which is around the self-managed organizational structure, is that we're now seeing two components within this. We're now seeing leaders set their own remuneration. So imagine a world in 5 years from now where all of the leaders in your boardroom sit in that boardroom and disclose their salary, their bonuses, their benefits, and they are all setting their salaries together. Now, the HR folks are up in arms at this because they don't, it's not compliant with privacy. It's
Sure.
it will force all sorts of discussions from a politics perspective and seniority and promotion. But there are organizations right now out in the world, I can tell you, because I've seen them with my research that I've engaged with, they're setting their own salaries, they're abolishing leadership titles, and they are focusing on abolishing job descriptions and role profiles. And again, it's all part of this bigger movement in the world of self-managed organizations to really focus on work that aligns with your purpose. Right, and again, Steve Jobs, we mentioned him earlier, but he believed in not hiring for someone for a job. He wanted to hire people that were smarter than him, that actually he would want to fire. Now, this is an HR nightmare for a lot of HR folks. And again, goes back to the comment I mentioned earlier when I was in this conference last year in Toronto. When I said what I just said to you to that conference, there were about 150 people in the conference, and I heard the gasps. It was like a swooshing kind of, that will never happen. But these people were at the forefront of innovation and disruption in HR, and they didn't even know that that's happening. So the craziest thing I've seen are those two things, and they're gathering momentum. And in about 3 or 4 years from now, we will have to adapt, because people, if you think about it, 2.5 million generation alphas are being born every week. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day. We don't even know how to develop millennials, let alone the generation that comes after them. So that's another crazy thing that HR needs to start to get on the front foot about. So they're my general views at this point, but there's a lot more behind the scenes that that we haven't even accounted for. So
absolutely, Paul. I fully agree. Heleniq, the craziest HR disruptive practices you've seen so far?
I think Heleniq's on mute.
I think a lot has already been said, and what I could add to that maybe is just my, I guess it's a desire, but perhaps it is already happening. I'm not sure. Maybe, in certain circles it's already happening, but I would just like to see HR getting very specialized training and very innovative training, I would like to call it. And something more like a kind of mastermind or think tank type training system to be implemented regularly and continuously, like a continuous professional development type style of exploration, because I think HR needs a lot of support right now, and disrupting the space, as I said it right at the beginning, I believe has already happened. It's already happening. So finding new ways to experiment, but to give the kind of support that's needed for this new thinking system to come into play and to begin to provide the space for that sector to play around with ideas and to really listen more deeply to the changing needs of people in the world now. I honestly don't believe anybody has these answers. This is what we are all here merging to help create together. So I would like to see more of that happening, and also cross departments, cross power levels. So if those kinds of trainings could have on purpose people that are not in HR, people that are practicing in very different ways about the needs of future generations, about how work is changing, about tech, many different things. I think that could be a very helpful practice.
Could I just mention something else? And I think it's quite a sobering reality. And I wanted to find it because it was from the research that Global Leadership Forecast did in 2018. And it talks about HR professionals are lagging behind in keeping up with digital transformation. And I'm referencing some of the material. And I'm happy to provide this after to the people on the panel as well as anyone that wants it. But I found this staggering, and I think it may need to be addressed in the HR community for some of the reasons, Heleniq, you were talking about earlier, around humble, heart-centered leadership. But so HR tend not to use data to drive decisions, recruitment, and inform their approaches to recruitment. But this research, again, it was over 30,000 people that were surveyed in this, 25,000 leaders and HR folks, and a range of others around the world. It said if HR are successful at applying analytics as part of their roles, they're 6.3 times more likely to report having individual career advancement opportunities. So basically what that's saying is if they get on board with digital transformation and using predictive analytics, then their own career can be enhanced rapidly. So whether or not that's a motivator, an extrinsic or an intrinsic one, is another discussion. But it really just struck me, which kind of comes back to the point of why are we in this business to begin with? Is it our own career advancement or the wider organization? So I just wanted to leave that. And the other sobering thing I just wanted to share in the midst of everything we're talking about, and you may know this already, but Gallup estimates that disengagement costs over $1 trillion every year. That's just in North America. It's over $7 trillion in the world, and over 50% of North American staff right now are looking for new opportunities. So this is a bigger issue than we have time to talk about here, and disruption is only one part of the discussion around having a more productive HR function, I think.
Sure, absolutely. So to the panel, I've got a couple of other areas. I know that we're almost at the final 10 to 15 minutes of this conversation, but there were some pressing issues that did come up, or rather pressing questions. So let me ask the first one. Every time we talk about HR practices and disruptive HR practices, rather, Google comes into mind, and people over here, even in our country, they keep comparing ourselves to Google. And so let's take one component of it that keeps coming up often, and it's the fact that they give free food and all of those stuff. Now, is the giving of free food to employees a disruptive HR practice, or are they doing it just because they can and they can afford it? I'm sure many companies would love to do that, but then affordability comes into question. So is that HR disruptive practice, or is it simply because your pockets are deep and you were able to do it, so you did it? Any thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts. I want the two ladies on the call to go first on this one, because I'm going to be quite controversial.
Yes. So Google is often looked at as an employer of choice. They employ or have a history of employing very smart people and treating them well. If you expect people to work very long hours, then you can perhaps extend that. If you provide food, they created that sort of organization and those sort of relationships, and it's worked in that context. I'm not sure that the secret is that everybody else should follow it. The secret is to find out what's important to your employee base and then see whether you can offer that. And it may not be offering what they're asking for. It might be thinking of something that's close to that and surprising them, because I think the reason Google is internationally famous for its employment practices is because they were surprising when they were first implemented. So. Right.
Heleniq, any thoughts on that? And we have a few other questions lined up. So yeah.
A great point from Katherine. I think it's really on point with another general highlight for my take on what we're talking about today, which is really the individualistic tendency, or let's say the trend that we're seeing in the world more towards individualism. I think leaders are at the moment going to do way better and HR, everybody involved really, every individual really, by becoming much more strong in their own individuality, and in that being able to make the kind of decision that takes into account everybody else's individuality. And we're seeing a kind of movement towards both polarities, you know, being able to think more as a community, as an entire planet. So I call that community thinking or global thinking, standing together as a kind of unified front in terms of all the issues that our planet is facing, because we need to be real that, you know, HR sits in a context right now of a changing world, and there are many environmental factors, many future changes that are impacting. And then, of course, we've got, you know, this move towards individuality. And so to be comparing what we do to what other people do is kind of pointless. It's not going to get us far. And it's a little bit of the old style. It's the old paradigm of thinking. It got us into this mess in the first place, because we have all those defenses and ways that we try and protect ourselves from not looking as bad and trying to look better. So it's more about standing in your own individuality, I really think, is a theme that we should be looking into with the greatest respect and integrity, and to really listen to what other individuals need in the company. This is a kind of active listening skill that I think Google does in a very interesting kind of non-conformist with anyone else's standard type. That's why we all look to it as an example, but rather than copying that example, it's more around looking at becoming our own creative individual who is able to, you know, innovate something for our own teams, our own communities, our own groups out there.
Right. So Paul, we are ready for your go for it.
Well, I think it's just a fad. I think this you know, the giving free food, you know, it's just like the companies that give foosball tables and kind of like, you know, jet you off to Hawaii if you've worked 90 hours a week to deliver a project, and oh great, you're really well loved by your employer. It's a gimmick. I've worked for management consulting firms all over the world, and I've even been one of those leaders that we had a proposal that was due 8 o'clock in the morning. We worked until 5 a.m. to get the team working on the proposal. So I bought them beers, bought them pizzas. You know why I did it? Because my partners wanted me to get the most out of these people and burn them out to get the proposal in on time. Right. Don't be fooled by it. It's a management fad. It's a leadership diatribe. And actually, let me just reinforce some of that stuff for you. Technology companies in general, I mean, we all hail Google, but just give you some sobering statistics about technology companies and the way they invest in their talent. Basically, technology companies spend less than 15%, on average, 15% less than any other industries on talent development. And guess what? 4 out of 10 technology leaders are failing in their roles. That's the highest failure rate for any leadership in any industry across the world. Wow. 32% of leaders in the technology sector never meet with their managers to discuss performance development. So if you want to be talking about disruptive HR practices in technology, focus on that. Don't worry about giving free sandwiches out and free pizzas out at the world's most glorified search engine. I love Google. I think it's a great addition to our lives. But let's not be fooled. Let's not think about this company as being the best in the world. You want to also explode the myth about the 20% rule that Google has. It's a joke. It's an absolute, like 20% of their time to spend on anything they want. What actually happens is you work 100% of your time, and that 20% is bolted onto the 100%. It's slave labor. So you know, my views on this are quite controversial, because I've seen how companies that can get put into the employer of choice category are seen as great examples to hold up, like the big consulting firms of the world. But once you've actually worked in there for a few years and you've burned out because they've got regressive HR practices, you realize that all the hype isn't all the hype. And so I would warn anyone listening to this is to do your due diligence with companies like that. So, you know, it's just like the consulting environment. We get you in, we basically get you lots of free food, we give you lots of, you know, nice hotel rooms when you're working overnight and you're deadline driven. But be under no illusion, folks. It's all for a capitalistic gain. There's no corporate social responsibility in this at all. So I knew it would be controversial.
I think it's really appreciative that you did bring it up, and thank you, Paul. I mean this is again, it's a viewpoint. You put it out there, and it's important for us to hear this out, so that like you said, we can think for ourselves and then use this information in the decisions that we make in the future. I know we are almost out of time, but I just have to squeeze this in, because in Sri Lanka this is a big area that we do talk about, we do tackle about. So this is with regards to leaves. Now, in Sri Lanka, it's mandated. We get 14 days of annual, 7 days of casual, which is a lot more than what other countries would get. Now, Netflix, I was just going through the culture deck and some of the things that Netflix did, and one of the things that they did was they took off the leave limits. I think if I'm not mistaken, their salaried employees can take as much time as they want. Now, every time we bring this up to our leaders here, the first thing they say is, "Oh, this is Sri Lanka. Oh, that's the US. Oh no, there must be some hidden agenda." Or sometimes they're like, "Oh no, there must be some hidden catch." And one common trope that we also hear from our side is that they feel that if you lift the leave limit, people would just not show up to work. But research says that the opposite happens. When you remove a leave cap, people don't take as much leave, probably because they know, okay, hey, if I want to take a leave, I can take a leave, and there's no need for me to be fearful of running out of leaves and so on. So any thoughts on that? Is that considered HR disruptive practices, what Netflix does? Or did rather, and is that common around the world? And this is a big pressure point in this part of the world, especially.
It's not common practice, and it's probably original rather than disruptive. And I don't find it very challenging, although I understand that it is in some contexts. What always happens with leave, if you implement it properly, is it needs to be approved. So even if it's unlimited, if there are business reasons for leave not happening, then managers and/or HR still have control. So things like that give employees the feeling that they've got some influence over the relationship with their employer, which is great. They've got flexibility when they need it, but I don't think it introduces undue risk.
Interesting. Heleniq, any points?
Yeah. I'm going to jump in sharing something that I noticed in the Netherlands, living there for 4 years. There is very high levels of burnout, which led me down a track to also investigate a lot more the health and well-being of the future, which led me to Dr. Deepak Chopra and very interesting research from the Gallup Institute there. And I think Paul mentioned some there as well around disengagement in the workplace, cardiac arrest, 9 o'clock Monday mornings, and rejection by your boss versus critique from your boss, and how it affects engagement. And of course, when you look at human behavior and performance and productivity, and rightly so, now we've added in this very important little pivot that Paul gave us as well about purpose. We can see that a lot of studies are showing this, and we know it as, let's say psychologists, therapists, we deal with the aftermath of people in those very problematic work relationships. And we definitely don't have this work-life balance, whatever you want to call it, code. Sure. Or let's say that we don't have the secret key for it yet. We're still figuring it out. And I think this disruptive HR conversation is a very good case in point for it all, that really it comes down to purpose and meaning. And if people are not doing that at their office, and they're not feeling that kind of alignment with their own personal value system, with what they do, their motivation, engagement, everything else is going to drop off anyway. So all this kind of regulated, disciplined kind of boss or corporate structure, let's say, that keeps people in a certain framework, which we are definitely questioning today, is the way we've managed all that behavior in the past. But we see now that it's not a working solution for the future, that it's creating a lot of unhealthy people. People burn out in these structures. And in the Netherlands, they are actually much more open right now to managing the burnout process with an entire supportive intervention, which in my mind is, you know, somewhat to be questioned as well, because it then sort of endorses the fact that people are going to burn out and, hey, we have a system to catch you. But what I think I learned from it is that really now, as a result, people are allowed to request to work a 4-day week. And in some companies, it's considered very acceptable that after a certain amount of service, you are, you know, going to spend time more with your kids or family, or you need more health care, whatever it is. So that's already showing us that a very progressive country like this, and maybe other examples you've just mentioned, are beginning to, they have to find ways to deal with this. And I think we're going to need it way more in the future, because we're not just talking now about misbehaving employees who want to go, you know, to a wild Route 66 travel for 2 years and take off. We're actually seeing people that have health issues. We have chronic illnesses that are causing people to burn out quicker. We have, you know, all kinds of unsustainable resources, both human and external, that are causing people to find more meaning in their lives, and they realize that just working is not really the only solution to life, right?
Sure.
So my main point then being that if anything, we need to maybe even consider whether we're willing to go into these experimental spaces. I love that Katherine says she doesn't think it's so challenging, that it can be approved still, but what would happen if we gave people more autonomy and more agency in their lives as employees? What would that reveal to a company about how well they manage to fix on the values and the purpose of the work that's done into the life of that person? And what does it reveal? What would really happen if a company had that open policy and people were really able to initiate their own leave, to really even start up new avenues, new projects doing that, and even you know, be a bit of a diagnostic tool for people to see where they need to fix more processes for motivating, for really developing the talent of these people.
Absolutely. Paul?
Fascinating discussion, fascinating. I'm going to add to it here because there's a lot more beneath the surface, again, as you're getting used to my style and the way I do things here. You know, I said 25 years ago when I was working with in the consulting industry that staff could be more productive remotely. They didn't need to be in a bricks and mortar environment to deliver value. I was a lot younger then, a lot less experienced, and a lot less grey hair as well, and nobody listened. 25 years later, they were listening. And why are they listening? Not because of the grey hair or a few hundred projects, but because they were forced to. Heleniq said earlier, nobody likes change. COVID was a completely unexpected event in our lives. Again, it's not the only COVID that will happen. There'll be others. But all of a sudden, the naysayers, and this has a point to the question you asked ultimately about trust in our employees and trust, like, to do the right thing that's aligned to a sense of purpose. Everybody thought 25 years ago that people would be unproductive if they were not in your line of sight. Well, an enforced change like COVID, actually, if you look at the data, has produced more productivity in employees around the world, right? So all of those people now that didn't want you out of their sight 25 years ago because they didn't trust you to do the work without watching you are now eating their humble pie. The world will continue to change and evolve like this. Let me just bring you back to something, though, around engagement. Heleniq, you mentioned it. Studies around, Robert Half in 2018 did a study and it revealed a third of employee respondents said they'd pass up the perfect job if the company's culture was a bad fit. 91% of US managers in the poll said an employee's culture fit was more important than the experience or skills they brought. What do you think defines a culture? It's comprised of a number of things, but particularly it's about the way that you interact with your boss around discussions like annual leave, right? So, for instance, and the way you feel valued or not. I'll give you an example from my own experience. Every time I've joined a consulting firm, be it the big four consulting firms or a boutique, I have in the recruitment process, which, by the way, it tends to be a very expensive, time-consuming one at that, and ineffective. But I have, when the annual leave conversation comes up, so I'm from the UK originally, it was typical to have 30 days annual leave plus any stat days. When I moved over to Canada, they wanted to give me, as a leader in the company, they wanted me to have 10 days annual leave. Now, in addition to that, I always have a conversation about productivity and outcomes-based delivery. So I would always request an additional 4 weeks unpaid leave in addition to the annual paid leave that I would have. Now, some companies didn't like that because, again, productivity, you're not there on site, etc. But when you have a leader and an HR VP or head of HR who sees you as talent rather than a job description, then it's a very different culture that you create. So amidst all of this is the backdrop that the millennial generation, the ones that we're now developing as leaders, have very different expectations of what it's like to be in the workforce. They will actively not work with your company because you will not give them unpaid leave or paid leave. If you restrict their movements, they will not join your company. That will result in a brain drain, a talent departure. And again, nobody's thinking about who comes after millennials. So the point I'm making of all this is, Richard Branson famously said as well, he allows employees to tell him how much vacation they want. And the irony is that when you empower someone, you get the best out of them. You don't have to worry about clock watching. You don't have to worry about the work-life balance, the work-life integration. And more to the point, if you're hiring the type of candidate that actually is aligned to your purpose, so if their individual purpose is aligned to your organizational purpose, you have higher levels of engagement already. HBR did a study a few years ago about high potential employees and leaders. And I think we all know that hypos, as they're called, they are more heavily invested in than any other talent category. But did you know that their engagement and productivity scores are the lowest when it comes time to them deciding how long they're going to stay in your organization? 1 in 4 hypos right now intend only to stay in the organization that they've been recruited for a year. Over 50% of hypos are looking for new roles now. Now, why am I saying all this? Again, it's a bigger conversation than just the annual leave discussion. Sure. But we are losing a lot of talent because we're not looking at the culture that we want to create for them to come into. So when you have a conversation, I've in my experience, believe it or not, or you probably can believe it as a corporate rebel and shit disturber that I am, I've walked out of interviews with partners from very well-established consulting firms who have balked at the idea of me taking unpaid leave. Now, I'm a top revenue producer. I produce millions of dollars for clients. And for me, that says a lot about a company's culture. So, if we learn anything from this conversation about annual leave, it's the fact that, as we move forward, we're going to have more talent in the workforce that are self-serving. We're going to have a higher level of staff in the gig economy. We haven't even talked about that as part of this conversation. Yeah. But the gig economy has completely different rules for the conversation that we're having. In fact, there are no rules. So we are going to see a bit of a change in the way that the talent are recruited and onboarded and actually kept in an organization. So it's a great question. It scratches the surface of a bunch of things. And by the way, to Heleniq's point around burnout and valuing talent, is there is there a correlation between the fact that the US has the lowest number of annual leave days on average for employees and the highest level of burnout for their employees and the highest level of disengagement? Is there a correlation between that? I mean, I think we know the answer. So
yeah, absolutely. Sure. So thank you so much, Paul. Well, with that, I mean, I wish this conversation went on for another half an hour because there's so much to discuss, so many points, so many questions, so many stories we want to hear. But I'm afraid we are out of time, and we have to sadly come to a close of today's conversation on disruptive HR practices. So a big thank you to our guests, Katherine, Heleniq, and Paul. Thank you so much for being with us here today. It's been a pleasure. So do stay back for a few minutes after our live session has ended for a short debrief. So with that said, a big shout out goes to the Luminary team and to our audience who tuned in today. Thank you very, very much. And another reminder to our viewers, all our past episodes of This, That, and the Other and other webinars are available on Luminary Learning Solutions YouTube page. So do swing by our page. Don't forget to like videos and hit that subscribe button. Well, next week, we'll be talking about a topic that's rarely explored in our country and around the world, to be honest. We're going to be talking about expats and trailing spouses, the trials and tribulations of working abroad. So don't forget to tune in next week. I'm Varun Chandramohan. Thank you for joining us today. See you next Saturday.